So we talk about getting information to our long-term memory through rehearsal, through meaningful learning experiences, through organization, through elaboration. And the last process is through visual imagery. I hope share a funny something funny with you, but in the last video, I had my battery was going low on my computer, and my son wanted to do some laundry and stuff. So I had things going on at the same time while I was trying to teach the lesson here, and just goes to show you, I was distracted. I found myself repeating a couple things. I got off track a little bit simply because I'm trying to focus on what I'm doing here, but I have things going on in my environment that were pulling at me, distracting me. It's the same thing in any given classroom. Classrooms aren't labs. Classrooms are real. They're not superficial. And as a result, we're going to find our own attention being pulled from us as teachers, as students, and the idea is we can't hold a student's attention all the time. Okay, I use an example in class a lot of times, which is I'll have each of you sit there and focus on one of my shoes, and I want everybody just to focus on my right shoe. And as soon as you find yourself being distracted or your attention going to something else, I want you to raise your hand. And what's funny is it doesn't take but 5 seconds, 10 seconds, you find students putting their hands up. Why? Because they start thinking about something else and their attention's drifted. Now somebody else raises their hand and the person next to them sees the hand go up and then they're distracted. And it's just that's how the nature of our attentional capacity or working memory capacity works. So we want our students to elaborate on information as much as possible, much more likely to be stored effectively, much more likely to be retrieved when it's stored connected to information, and that's one of the goals. The last is visual imagery. You've heard the expression, picture's worth 1,000 words. Very true. As a teacher, we want students to learn things and store information in many ways. If they can encode the information visually, auditorily, through smell, touch, etc., much more effective. That's why it's always strongly encouraged that students take notes. Why? Because as they're taking notes, they're listening, they are writing as they're writing, they're organizing, they're seeing what they're writing. All of these, they're processing information auditorily, kinesthetically, visually. The more ways that you process the information, the more likely it is to be retrieved. So visual imagery is a very strong strategy to help students process information, especially in conjunction with other forms of storing information. Now, you got to recognize that most of the stuff we process are, we like to think of them as mental snapshots, but they're not as pristine and detailed as pictures are. With time, those images fade. We don't have photographic memories. We don't remember all the detail. Stuff gets vague, vague and gets a little bit fuzzy around the edges, etc. Okay. But we can construct images without ever seeing it based on our understanding of stuff. You know, when you think about the person who is doing a drawing of someone, a sketch drawing, they say, "Well, what do you remember about this person?" They have to do it. They've never seen them, but from the person's description, they can actually form a visual image, and it can be stored very quickly and for a very long period of time with very little decline. Whereas with words, think about it. This model right here, you'll see pictures in the book. You could have 2 pages describing the model, but just the model itself, one picture, heck of a lot easier to remember than 2 pages, right? So we store information in a number of different ways. But eventually, like you guys next week and like your students will have, they got to retrieve that information from long-term memory. And we've talked about how we can effectively store it, but how do we retrieve the information when we need it? We know that retrieval of information from long-term memory depends upon somewhat on how well organized it is or how well we stored that information. Well, when you think about information that is going to be retrieved in our classrooms, it of course depends on the age as well. There are several ways in which we help as teachers the retrieval process. Our goal is not just to teach stuff, but to teach stuff in a meaningful way so that students will be able to retrieve the information at a later date. Now, one of the things that we like to do as much as possible as teachers is help our students make multiple connections to existing knowledge. What does that mean? You're teaching a unit in one class, and this teacher's talking about the same stuff in another class. The more ways that we can integrate a curriculum, the much more likely we are to remember that information at a later date. So, what can we do? Say you're doing a unit in science, and you're talking about, in the science class, you're talking about earthquakes and the shifts in tectonic plates and how that, along fault lines, et cetera, et cetera. Well, it's one thing to understand the science of something. It's very different to understand the effects of an earthquake on families, on individuals. In an English class, in a literature class, you read stories about it. Maybe you've heard about how a tsunami works underground, the waves and how that creates. But what is a tsunami like when it hits a fishing village or hits a country, an island, a fishing area? What's the effects of a tsunami on the culture, the economy? There's a lot more to it. And the idea is when we integrate curriculum, we start to realize that this stuff, the more connections to that information, the more likely they are to retrieve it. So whenever we get a chance to integrate curriculum with other teachers and stuff, great strategy. Learn the information to mastery. You learn to mastery is like learning stuff to automaticity. Think about when you're driving, learning how to drive. Remember that? 10 o'clock, 2 o'clock, you're driving, you're focusing on the road, tunnel vision, right? Friends of yours say, oh, look over there. You're like, real quick, turn the music on. They're like, what? What we find is that early on, new drivers, very tunnel vision because they haven't learned to automatically, that automaticity in driving. And as they get older, as drivers get more experienced, they can start to eat a sandwich and turn the music and listen to what people are talking about and wave to their friends as they're driving. Suddenly you see them doing lots of skills at one time because driving straight down the road requires less attentional capacity, less working memory capacity. So you learn things to mastery, boom, they can do it. Like learning to drive a stick shift, If you haven't ever done that before, you realize that early on, engaging that, you put the clutch in, put the gear in, put it in a gear, let go of the clutch, hit the accelerator, doing all these things at one time. Oh my God, it's hysterical to watch somebody learn how to drive a stick. But the point is that when you do those things again and again and again, pretty soon it becomes automatic. Learning stuff to mastery. We also like to learn things frequently. Use things frequently. As a teacher, the reason that we do homework or the reason that we do certain skills or maybe even have worksheets or whatever else is to get a certain familiarity with the content. Doing different problems, using the same principle again and again and again, pretty soon that information is much more easily retrieved because you've done the assignment with different problems lots of different ways. Writing different essays, etc. Using information frequently helps to retrieve that information. And then lastly is good retrieval cues. Teachers like to develop good retrieval cues because we want our students to be able to remember stuff. Sometimes teachers use mnemonic devices. You have a mnemonic device such as, like we used it earlier, the Roy G. Biv, okay? Or PEMDAS, or, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, for order of operations. Or we use certain things as a way to help us remember the process. FOIL, first, outer, inside, last. The idea is those mnemonic devices are great retrieval cues to help us remember exactly what we need to do in a problem, right? So the idea as a teacher is it's not just teaching stuff, but we're trying to facilitate that retrieval of the information. So learning things to mastery, making multiple connections, using things frequently, developing good retrieval cues. Those are all great strategies to help our students remember that stuff. But even still, we do everything right, and then still sometimes students forget stuff. Why do students forget stuff? Okay? Well, there's any number of reasons as to why students might forget things, okay? One of the things that you find most common is that students have a difficulty retrieving, failure to retrieve information because perhaps they didn't store it very effectively. Maybe they didn't, they just were trying to memorize stuff. They didn't think about it. They didn't make connections. And as a result, they failed to store it. They are failure to retrieve it because they just didn't have any connections. Loosely stored information, when you go to retrieve it from a while, it just disappears. Another one is what we refer to as a reconstruction error. Think about that story I read to you in the beginning of this video series. You heard it, you thought about it, I asked you a series of questions, and when you don't have the exact information or can't recall something verbatim, we have a tendency to kind of fill in the gaps. We call that sometimes a reconstruction error. We fill in what makes sense, what would be normal there, what we thought would fit in there. And actually, it might not be accurate, but it seemed logical. That's called or referred to as a reconstruction error. One of the popular reasons as to why people forget stuff is what we call decay. And we know that. We've talked about it before. Some of us think about the pruning process of these connections. And sometimes it's the same basic premise with decay. If you don't use it, you lose it, right? So decay is a natural process by which, over time, certain memories, certain synaptic connections are just pruned and we just lose them. That's why we want to keep stuff fresh in our students' memory, using it often, using it frequently, revisiting content, so that we less likely to have information decay. One other reason is what we refer to as interference. Interference is what we find when a student is learning something. Say you're learning, you have a pretty good foundation in Spanish. You understand how to read things in Spanish, say things in Spanish, starting to feel comfortable in Spanish. And then you start introducing something like a conversational German. Maybe you get to the double R's in German and you start to trill your R's, and you're not supposed to do that in German. And what happens is you see double R's and you pronounce things with a different accent or different way of pronouncing it because your previous knowledge in double R's in Spanish influenced or interfered with your pronunciation of the double R's in German. What we find is sometimes learning stuff about Piaget and Vygotsky, and they're kind of similar, and you learned it in this way in one class, and you learned it this way in another class, and this similar content, they just overlapped, and they interfered with one another, creating this difficulty in remembering it accurately. And in this situation, we forgot it, or we forget stuff because they were done a little bit differently, or learned a little bit differently. So the idea is that all the best students, all the best teachers, we all forget stuff. And there's a lot of reasons why. We don't store it very effectively. We can retrieve some stuff, but not others. Maybe it decays over time. Maybe one thing was kind of similar to something else and it interfered. So there's any number of different reasons as to why we may forget stuff, okay? So as a teacher, I always think about, okay, what is this information? How do I use this information in my classroom? Eric, you talk a lot about theory, a lot of other stuff. Put it all back together and you say, okay, how do I take these information processing, this theory, these principles, and put them into play? And you'll see I have a PowerPoint in there, and there's 5 basic things I like to keep in mind. Okay, first, meaningful learning should be emphasized over rote memorization most of the time. If we can make meaningful connections to us, much more likely to store effectively, much more likely to be retrieved. Secondly, make sure students have sufficient knowledge base that the material can be related to. They don't have a foundation, they don't have prior knowledge, they don't have schemes in place. Really hard to accommodate, really hard to adapt, really hard to make connections to it, right? Third, material should be organized. The more organized, the more likely it is to be stored efficiently, more likely to be retrieved. We want to, fourth, encourage students to elaborate. When students can expand on knowledge using previously learned information, it's more likely to be stored effectively and retrieved more easily. And lastly, encourage storage with retrieval in mind as a teacher. Think about when they'll need it. so they'll store it effectively.